Buen día, my name is Jessica Hernandez. Welcome to Daughters of Madre Earth, Episode 3.
Tú eres la linda y petrona, clavel de Tehuantepec. Tú eres la linda y petrona, clavel de Tehuantepec. Rosa de Castilla en rama y petrona, cortada al amanecer. Rosa de Castilla en rama y petrona, cortada al amanecer. Petronita de mi vida, Petrona, tú eres mi amada. Petronita.
My name is Stacy, aka Chinantec in Diaspora, and I'm one half of Daughters of Mother Earth.
Today's episode, we're going to talk about cultural appropriation. Our first question is, what is cultural appropriation?
So the first response we got was from Yaretsi_33, and they said, fashion industries stealing designs from indigenous people, like Carolina Herrera, who launched her new clothing line inspired by Mexico. There's been a lot of backlash to her because of this.
Our next response is from Dr. Sina Aguilera, and her response, or their response, is, cultural appropriation is adopting from a culture that you don't have a right to be a part of. An appropriator picks out the parts of the culture that they like and leave out the struggle of the lived experience and historical context that they can never be and don't want to live in.
And the next response is from Lizzie Visitante, who said, cultural appropriation is so harmful because everyone wants to dress up and celebrate the cultural aspect of indigenous communities, but no one wants to deal with the realities of being indigenous. I always think about the carnavales, particularly the Carnaval de Oruro. You have to pay to dance, and it's one of the many events when mestizos and white Latinxes dress up and dance indigenous dances. Meanwhile, low-income indigenous folks sell their merchandise at the side of the parade.
Wow. So, Stacy, what do you think cultural appropriation is?
I think cultural appropriation is the exploitation and the desecration of another community's culture that is not your own, or maybe, that is not your own.
Yeah, for me, I think cultural appropriation, I agree with you, is also adding to the oppression that other communities face for their culture. For instance, like, dreads, the Black community faces a lot of, like, that's not professional, but then you have, like, non-Black folks, putting dreads on their hair and being praised for being beautiful because they have those dreads on them.
Yeah, I think that's very disrespectful, because I think a lot of times people don't want to or don't realize like the difference in like power structure or positionality that they have in terms of privilege. Like, for example, when non-Black Latinxes will culturally appropriate or make an entire business out of indigenous and or Black cultures. And like a lot of times I feel like they don't want to acknowledge that that they do have a lot of privilege in terms of like society usually giving them the upper hand over our communities when it comes to who gets to say that this is valuable or it isn't.
Yeah, and to like also bring up something to your point, like when they, like people who resell indigenous crafts or like Afro crafts on Etsy, like they're charging people like 10 times what they actually paid the artisan, and I think that's very interesting because like when you look at the power and privilege dynamics that non-black and non-indigenous folks have, even if they're people of color, there's always that market price that there people are willing to pay them like $85 for an embroidered blouse, but the indigenous woman or the crafters are actually embroidering those shirts only get paid like $3 or $2, and they're haggle a lot as well. So
yeah, that's very real, and like something I feel that is not talked about a lot is the not just the economic, but also the geographical consequences that it has on our people. But I don't know if you want to talk about it right now or you want to go into that later after some of the other responses.
Yeah, we can go on it later. Our next response is from @65 Pink Roses. Thank you for this response, as it's very informative. And I guess I can read half of it and then you can read the next half. So it starts as cultural appropriation. If we define it by the sociological definition, is the use of adoption of cultural items, iconography, traditions by a person or group who is not part of the culture from which two parts, mutual cultural appropriation and unshared cultural appropriation. Unshared cultural appropriation happens against the will of the peoples whose culture is being appropriated. This is what happens, for example, with Frida Kahlo, when cultural items like the clothing are claimed without involvement by the creators of that clothing. This type of appropriation is harmful because it denies people their cultural authorship and is generally a part of the system that oppresses them. When Frida claimed indigenous identity through clothing, it was the detriment of her indigenous servants as she denied them profit for their work representation. She became the global face of Mexico, not the creators of the art she touted, and artistic recognition.
By unshared cultural appropriation, Frida gained a political voice, but harmed the indigenous artists she stole from. Unshared cultural appropriation exists within a system of unequal social power and is continuously harmful as a result. I believe this can only be changed if socio-political power were to be equally shared with indigenous peoples. But that's currently a more distant dream. Mutual cultural appropriation has, in opposition to unshared, benefits for both parties. Mutual cultural appropriation is what happens when a group or person from a culture chooses to willingly share parts of their culture with another group not from that culture. This is what happens when an indigenous person chooses to sell their art for fair wages, teaches a tradition, a recipe to non-indigenous friends, or give someone a piece of their traditional art. The benefit here exists when an individual with more socio-political power can use this mutual appropriation to transfer some power to the originator. For example, wearing a piece of embroidery you purchased, and constantly sharing it with others, the indigenous business it came from, and lifting up the creator. Or, for example, if I wear a weekend my abuela gave me, who received it as a gift from the artist and used it to educate others that, one, this art can't be claimed by a mestizo like myself. Two, if they go to Mexico, they should only patron indigenous artists and not resellers. The proliferation of embroidery for sale in tourist market. Oh, sorry, those three. The proliferation of embroidery for sale in tourist first range indigenous pueblos in Mexico. I personally think that cultural items can be used when there is a most useful cultural appropriation, and the person who receives these items does not claim authorship. Unshared cultural appropriation in Mexico perpetuates the myth that we are all indigenous, and so we can be racist, or we can't be racist. By claiming indigenous cultures and promoting pan-indigeneity while denying individual communities their identities and legacy, or an agency. There are some items that are truly the result of culture sharing in Mexico, like Spanish colonial culture-based features that mestizos can wear without erasing indigenous voices. And I believe that we can, or that we need to recognize the important differences between our socio-cultural experiences in order to both pay homage to our own ethnic and cultural background, while actively working to uplift indigenous culture and crediting their authorship, supporting their socio-political upliftment.
Thank you at 65 Pink Roses for this response. What are your thoughts on it, Stacy?
Yeah, so I'm gonna go over, like, I guess the cultural appropriation definition.
Mm-hmm.
I think I agree with a lot of things that this individual said. In the fact that cultural appropriation is harmful, how it's defined, and how Frida Kahlo's impact at the cost of the detriment of her indigenous servants, and that she denied them profit from their work, their representation, and she literally became like a fake face for a lot of Zapotec and Oaxacan culture and indigenous cultures. I really don't like that about her. I don't think she was revolutionary at all. I think she was just another, like, middle class, privileged mestiza who was politically connected, and that gave her a lot of access to advantages that are not given to indigenous people. But I think the only thing is, I think I agree with some of the things that were said under mutual cultural appropriation, but I don't think that's cultural appropriation. I think that's just like sharing and knowing how to engage respectfully, because I don't see, like, necessarily theft going on with that. So I'll probably just use a different term, but I do agree with the ways that we can support indigenous communities directly, like supporting the indigenous artisans, small businesses directly versus the resellers. What about you?
Well, I think it's very interesting, right? Because Frida Kahlo is known for her self-portraits in which she painted herself through a reflection of an indigenous woman, because she was wearing the Tejuana dresses or huipiles that are very prominent in the Zapotec culture. To this day, I still ask myself if Frida Kahlo is a colonial or decolonial legacy, given that now our Tejuana, our regalia is coined as Frida style or Frida clothing, which is very interesting. It is kind of like a interesting approach to be in, because I know that a lot of our Zapotec women who are weavers and embroiderers do, like, their livelihood is connected to selling our embroideries. And I think that while it is a livelihood, it's also important to give them the acknowledgement that our huipiles and our unique embroidery that's actually connected to a lot of our native flowers that are found in Oaxaca should not be labeled as Frida Styles or Frida given the credit as though she's the one who discovered the clothing, because it's been used in our culture for centuries, even before Frida existed or was born. The only thing is that, obviously, because we do modernize and adapt to our, unique surroundings, there's new material that we used for our embroideries, like velvet, that, was introduced post-colonialism. But I think it is important to acknowledge that Frida did appropriate indigenous clothing and cultural, especially from Oaxaca. It is known that, she was not Zapotec, but mestiza. Her dad was a wealthy German settler, and her mom was mestiza, right? So all of the indigeneity that people now claim, because she never claimed herself to be mestiza or indigenous, she claimed to be Mexican through that Mexican nationalism lens that's very embedded in Mexico. It's interesting because, like, she became Frida Kahlo, known for her self portraits, but she was now wearing her, you know, what I would consider German clothing, or, she was appropriating indigenous clothing for sure.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I have one more thing to add, but I don't know if you're done yet, or do you want to add
Yeah,
more?
I'm done for sure.
Okay. So yeah, one more thing I want to add is just like, so I've been looking into like exactly. Well, sometimes it just shows up, like the thing with Disney and Pixar and the movie Coco, and I just like I have to wonder exactly how much is owed to, like, economically wise, to Zapotec, Chinantec, Mixtec, Triqui, and indigenous nations and pueblos because of cultural appropriation. Like the Frida Kahlo brand probably has made millions of dollars. I know, like, for sure the movie Coco has. So it's like, damn, all of that work, all of those millions of dollars should actually be going to Zapotec, to indigenous people directly. And it's just like, it really sucks to see that. And I just hope that, moving forward, people can be more conscious and instead, support indigenous vendors and indigenous small businesses directly, or even like take the extra step and ask, like, hi, I would like to know if this business is indigenous owned. I think that could help a lot. But yeah, those were just like my other 2 cents on that response.
Yeah, and also, like, I agree with you, and also, like, providing them with opportunities to be, to serve on as a director for movies like Coco, because I feel like even though, like, they can be paid for their culture, like, these people who are appropriating the culture are still going to make millions. So why not, like, give those opportunities to, instead of like hiring 2 white directors, hire like an indigenous director, teach them how to use that technology, or the screenwriters. Like, there's a lot of opportunities that indigenous peoples can also deal, like, have, but they're not granted those opportunities because they always go to the white men, right? Because this is a white men society. Capitalism is run by white men. So, like, why not give those tools, equip indigenous peoples with those tools, so that instead of appropriating their culture, even if a fair price is paid for their, stuff or their knowledge, that they actually are the voice, right? Like, I think that's why Jalitza was a revolutionary image for us, because, as if you read through her life story, like, indigenous peoples are not given those opportunities to go into cinema. Indigenous peoples are not given the opportunities to be in Hollywood. So I feel like, even though, whether the way that the director, did that movie Roma was ethical, at least she was given the opportunity that we're always neglected, because 1, we don't have the education, and 2, we don't have the economic means to pursue that education, right? That Western education in that regards.
Yeah, that's hella real. Yes, thanks to all of that. Yeah. Do you want me to read off the next question?
Yeah, you can read off the next question.
Okay. So the next question we have is, what are some examples of cultural appropriation of Zapotec and Oaxacan cultures. The first response is from at Sailor Storm 86, and they said, I think Aztec dancers would be an example of cultural appropriation. Oh, that's interesting. I will like to get into that after the next response.
And our next response is from Kiwi Biwi. It's hard to draw a line between appropriation and appreciation. I think it comes down to what people feel in their hearts about the culture and how they view themselves in relation to that culture. There's no harm in appreciating learning only in attempt ownership or suppression. Addressing it always includes education and colonialism as a resulting privilege. And then I wanted to read this response because I think we touched upon it. At Spooky Luna, and it's our last response that I have on the notes. Did y'all think how it could be a neutral as well? Sometimes people find beauty in other cultures and choose to implement in their lives. This could lead to becoming less ignorant about another's culture, or you get white capitalism. An example, selling Mexican blankets on Etsy. I don't think culture appropriation is always black and white, like most topics. A varying degree of knowing you're ignoring a culture but continuing to take from a different culture will fall into appreciation. Example, watching Coco and wanting to participate in Mexican Dia de los Muertos traditions because you want to honor your loved ones. Probably not culture appropriation. These white girls who spend money on their face to look like calaveras on Halloween. Probably culture appropriation. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to give your insight on that section?
Yeah, so I mean, it is important to draw a fine line, but I feel like people have been called out for so many times that, like, for instance, like an example of like wearing headdresses to Coachella, like people have been educated, but there's still those people who still choose to wear headdresses at Coachella events, right, or music festivals. So like, is really education the way to go about it to address it? And also, it's interesting that Dia de los Muertos is associated to Mexican culture when we have to acknowledge that Mexico is still a settler state. There's still the oppression and genocide against indigenous peoples. Like if you read the news, our indigenous leaders and activists are killed on a daily basis. To associate it to the Mexican culture when in fact Dia de los Muertos is an indigenous tradition that was appropriated and as a result sold by Mexico so that we can increase the tourism that happens in that settler state.
Yeah, I think so too. I think a lot of times, yeah, cultural appropriation is done unintentionally, but that does not, like, a good intention will not take away the impact that it has, especially like systematically. It's important for us to self-reflect and think about, the ways that, purchasing certain things or supporting certain things can impact the indigenous populations and the black populations that it has been taken from, or even how these things have been acquired. Like, how was Dia de los Muertos brought to the United States? Because apparently it was not a thing out here until like the 70s in the Southwest. So I think we should talk about that another time. And yeah, I want to give my thoughts on the Aztec dancers as an example of cultural appropriation. That's an interesting one because, like, I grew up thinking that Aztec dance was, Aztec dance, but then after talking to some friends who are Nahua, they were telling me, like, oh, that's actually not really ours. Like, it's actually, and then I read another article that said it was a blend or a mix of dances from, like, I don't know if different indigenous communities or if they're even from indigenous communities. But I think, like, if it's something that takes from different indigenous like cultures and adds it to the dance, I think then maybe it should be renamed as like, I don't know, like descendants dance, or I don't know. That's that's something to think about.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we can come up with an episode that's kind of like decolonizing the Aztec movement, because there is a lot of articles and books written on how the Aztec movement generated by Chicanos as a result of like them trying to reclaim their indigeneity. So I think we can dive into whether that's actually the correct way to reclaim indigeneity or reclaim your ancestral roots. And the Aztec dances were actually reinvented or created after reading anthropological books. So we have to also keep in mind that anthropological books come from a white man's lens, and that that's not actually appropriate to recreate something reading those books. So I think that would be a good episode to also bring more awareness and actually include Nahuatls, who are the ones facing most of the cultural appropriation by the Aztec movement.
Yeah, yeah, I think so too. So if you're Nawa, feel free to reach out to us. We want to hear and empower what you have to say about your own culture and your experiences. And let me see.
And it's interesting because because the Oaxaca culture is very appropriated, and people are like, oh yeah, we appreciate it, but it's actually overly romanticized. That's why, as a result, tourism to Oaxaca City has increased severely, and Oaxaca City is an urban setting, and it's actually not where our indigenous communities live. But it's interesting because you do see a lot of resellers selling our artisans and crafts to the tourists, so it's very interesting that when we talked about cultural appropriation of Zapotec and Oaxacan cultures, how that's actually impacted tourism in Oaxaca City.
Yeah.
And not to say that indigenous peoples don't live in the city, but it's interesting when you visit Oaxaca City, who are the people who actually have the businesses. They're not indigenous peoples.
Right. Right. I think the context of the city matters, because I feel like there's been also a lot of out migration from pueblos into urban areas.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and I think another one more example that I want to go over in terms of like cultural appropriation of Zapotec and Oaxacan cultures is something that I mentioned before, the movie Coco by Disney and Pixar. And it's just like I initially, when I watched the movie, I was like, oh, the animation is really pretty, and like all those are alebrijes, but like animated differently, and I thought the animation was cute. In terms of the storyline, I have different thoughts about that. But I think, I read an article recently published by somebody who works for Disney, and interviewed the Disney consultation team, and it was they actually went to different parts of Oaxaca and like Zapotec artists and like culture carriers, and they used a lot of that to design the graphics and things in the movie. But from what I've heard is that they didn't provide like the appropriate or fair compensation to these communities, and they even used the image of a mujer from Michoacan as Mama Coco, and they didn't pay her for that either. And apparently they took apart like different stories from different people as they toured Mexico and put that together to create the movie Coco. And it was just like, it left me really shook, because I was like, damn, like most of that movie is based on cultural appropriation. Like never in my life did I ever think that any story could be like commodified or sold. Mm-hmm. And same thing with like Zapotec religious cultural practices.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. Sorry, we're gonna say something?
Yeah, because I bet you like people always say representation matters, but like, does that representation mean that people are allowed to appropriate indigenous cultures? Because I feel like representation does matter, but like when it's the creators who are non-indigenous peoples who came into the indigenous communities and exploited and told stories and appropriated a culture, is that actually a representation that you want to claim that matters to us?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm here for like accurate and empowering representation, not something that has been culturally appropriated, commodified, exploited, stolen, or even just like trauma porn that just focuses on our trauma. Like, that's not positive representation to me. Like, yes, sometimes we need to focus on like the struggles and bring attention and awareness to like different things, but even then, there's a way to do that. Like, a way to do that more responsibly. And I think that's part of like moving beyond just diversity and representation. But yeah, like another thing I wanted to add to that Coco movie was that it was actually like two Mexicans who approved the cultural appropriation of all of these indigenous nations and people and pueblos and mujeres. And that just speaks volumes because like nowadays in LA and like various parts of the U.S. apparently, like a lot of Mexicans or Chicanxes or Latinxes want to claim like that we're all indigenous, but clearly we're not. Clearly we're not, because you have to have a tie to a nation or a pueblo or something like that, and that's usually through your family line, because it's not necessarily based on enrollment. We don't really have enrollment down there, or top of the border. And so, like, the fact that these individuals and these people, like, said that it was okay to do that, like, it's just, like, so common and so systematic that I wasn't even surprised when I saw that it was two Mexicans, or, like, a Mexican and a Chicano who approved of that. Like, I think it's important, like you said, like, for us to have representation and positive images, but I think that we really need to be careful and to go into detail and to see, like, is this ethical? Like, am I hurting somebody when I do this? Especially, am I hurting an entire indigenous nation when I do this? Because then it's not empowering. It's just colonialism all over again.
Yeah. And I agree with you, because, like we mentioned, like the Dia de los Muertos has been commodified by Mexico because of the tourism. So now when people think of Dia de los Muertos, they're like, oh, it's a Mexican tradition. But we have to keep in mind and reinforce that Mexico is a settler state, and the oppression and deaths and genocides of indigenous peoples continues. And there is anti-blackness and there is racism embedded in that state. It's not like, oh, everybody who's from Mexico is indigenous. While it's important to claim your indigenous ancestry, you also have to do it by honoring and respecting the indigenous peoples who continue to be murdered and, face the consequences of post-colonialism as a result of, Mexico being a settler state. So, but I know it's hard, right, for people to acknowledge that sometimes.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Can you give me a second just to get my
from our community? So, and Monica mentioned, my favorite thing is when non-Zapotec people like to chime in and say, no, it's okay. But like Zapotec people are right there telling you no, like question marks. At Sal030123 said, there's no good reason to steal, period. At Yalina JC mentioned, I seen a photo floating around and it's supposedly Frida's mom's side of the family and they're in Tijuana dresses. Do you all know if it's a true picture of their family? At Trayula Hor mentioned, for me, cultural appropriation is when someone from another culture uses as a culture they're not educated in for personal purposes and doesn't acknowledge that culture belongs to someone else. And at Rock and Roll Club mentioned, graduation week always has me thinking about appropriation in regards to lace. I feel like there's a discussion worth having.
Yeah.
Do you want to continue reading the rest of our responses?
Yeah.
Okay, at Coconut Water mentioned, this is difficult to answer because I know my family doesn't particularly enjoy selling their artesanias, but they don't really have an option. If they don't sell their work, they have no source of income. We're basically forced to into selling our culture to people to make ends meet. You know, read the rest of the responses.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So this one is by at Casey Lee's. And they said, I've thought a lot about this too. As a black woman from Colombia, many of our cultural heritage is sold too. I think maybe we can sell artesanías related to our aesthetics, but that does not really mean anything to us. That are not from the heart. That are not the heart of our culture or our identity. Maybe. And Ivo Chingona said, in Frida's case, I think the harm it did was that many think the style is exclusively hers. On top of that, many forget Frida is half white, which, dot, dot, dot. And, yeah, did you read the one below that?
No.
Or, no? Okay, I'll just read it. It kind of always, okay, so Geno Senor said, it kind of hurts the more I educate myself on cultural appropriation that happens within the Latinx countries, especially Mexico, and how they like to pretend they're so proud of something they don't even educate themselves in. I don't know my roots, but I know it's a problem. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think this topic, there's a lot to discuss, so we can do a part 1 and a part 2 because we want to incorporate other voices and other, indigenous cultures that do face cultural appropriation. So our last question is, what are the economic, gender, and geographical impacts of cultural appropriation upon indigenous peoples?
Yeah. Okay. So economic, gender, and geographical impacts the cultural appropriation upon it. I think right now I want to talk about the geographical impacts, because I feel like that's something that is very much overlooked. So I'll just talk about that first. Well, no, actually, the gendered one is very overlooked. So I'll just start off with geographical. The geographical impacts of cultural appropriation is very real, and I think that has to do with like displacement, removal, or relocation of indigenous nations and pueblos and people that most disproportionately affect women who are the cultural bearers of women and LGBTQIA2 or mujer people that are the cultural bearers of our cultures, the creators and cultivators. And I think the geographical impact happens when, for example, we're forced to sell our own labor at a very, very low price that does not give us a livable wage. So then we are exploited and we do not have enough to make ends meet, or we are forced to remove ourselves from our own community and have to settle elsewhere in order to find job opportunities or a source of income that does help us, at the very least, make ends meet. And that is also geographical violence, because then we are removed from our ancestral homelands. And that's something that has happened in various ways to my family as well. And it's just very violent because there's so much trauma that comes with that, and it shouldn't be like that. So I think that's one aspect of the geographical impact of cultural appropriation on indigenous peoples. Do you want to speak on something, Jessica?
Yeah, and I also feel like because, we are very separated between like the US, Canada, Mexico, and and the rest of Latin America, like Mesoamerica. I feel that because people who are culturally appropriated indigenous cultures from Mexico have the voice in the United States and Canada, they kind of like have claimed that, like artesanías, that crafts, that huipiles as a Mexican identity or a cultural thing. But in reality, it is indigenous cultures that they're appropriating. And I feel that as a result, podcasts like ours, we want to amplify the voices of Indigenous peoples, especially women, queer, non-binary, two-spirited relatives that also come from Mesoamerica, which includes Mexico, Central America, and South America, because I feel like there's a lot of misinformation that has occurred because, some are the mestizos who have the privilege of being born in the United States, being raised here, and do have some lineage back in Mexico, have kind of like spread that misinformation that Mexico is a settler state and the cultural appropriation that they have actually partaked in as a result of, being
Yeah,
displaced and being born in the States and stuff like that.
yeah, yeah. I agree with that. Just like I had a private like social media that I use every now and then I was like, I think I want to make a public one. And so like I'm not really used to people listening to anything that I have to say, or not like anything, but generally, especially like in everyday life. I feel like people just read me as like a Oaxacan or Indigenous woman, and like, you know, people don't treat us in the nicest of ways. There's actually a lot of violence that is directed at us. So like, I don't know. I feel like I'm still understanding that, and I feel like, I don't know. I think social media is a pretty cool tool because then it's not just what I think, but it's like what other people think, what other like pueblos or people from other pueblos think. Outside of pueblos, like a lot of different stuff, and people have very important things to say. And yeah, I think that's why also I love this podcast and this platform because it's like very collective. We specifically speak to to censor our Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous women and LGBTQI, Two-Spirit, and Mujer community members. So, yeah. And one more thing that I want to highlight in the question is about the gendered impacts of cultural appropriation. So I feel like we did go a lot over the economics. The economic impact is that like probably millions and millions and millions of dollars is owed to Indigenous people for all of the culture and the theft that has been happening and taken from us. And I just think about that a lot because I'm like, I'm kind of like in a bit of a struggle, and I'm like, wow, like this wouldn't be happening if society was more just and more respectful towards Indigenous people. But in terms of the gendered impact, I feel that cultural appropriation disproportionately, and I think you said this too, disproportionately impacts women and LGBTQI and Two-Spirit people, because a lot of the work, like the blusas, the huipiles, the tenates, the baskets. Yes, men do that work, but I think it's mostly women who do that, at least within our nations and pueblos. And so that just adds another layer to how people really value or don't value women's labor and LGBTQI people's labor. And it's very valuable because my mom was teaching me how to embroider when I was very little, and like I stubbed my finger so many times. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this as a hobby. But yeah, and it's more than just that. It's like I know people in the pueblos make everything from scratch, from like the vela to the dyes that are used in the dresses and the blusas and the colors and everything. So it's just like a lot of work, and I think that it's very undervalued and underpaid. So I know that recently I saw one of the people I follow. Her name is Reina Chavelli, and she is helping her family sell their products directly and cutting out the middleman. And she sells it for a very fair price, and the proceeds go back to her family in her town. And I think that's just a wonderful example of like what can be done and how we can empower those small businesses and vendors that are Indigenous owned and Indigenous led. And yeah, just seeing that made me really happy. And I want to buy one for Blues sometime soon.
Yeah, and even her blouses are still relatively cheaper than when you see them on Etsy, because there's people. So imagine how much profit those people are making in regards to selling those blusas, or those blouses are embroidered by indigenous peoples in Mexico. And I feel like because southern Mexico, Chiapas, Oaxaca, we are matriarchal societies. Our women, because most of our economic revenue comes from our weaving and embroidery. That's why that also allows our women to remain the head of the households, because that's where our economic revenue comes from. So obviously, it does impact our gender, especially our indigenous women, to relatives, to spirit relatives, because our muse, who are non-binary men, who are males biologically, but they're also women. Um, they learn how to weave and embroider with our feet, indigenous women in our cultures.
Yeah, yeah, um, yeah, and it's interesting because I've heard about the movement identity, which is according to colonial terms of like assigned male at birth, but does even is more than just the two genders. And and yeah, I think I don't know. That's a lot. That's a lot to process. Um, but yeah, I think those are like my 2 cents on the the impact, or not my 2 cents because it's not 2 cents. My thoughts on the economic, gendered, and geographical impacts of cultural appropriation. And the next question, I think that's going to be like our last question, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Is okay, how can society be in solidarity with indigenous people regarding cultural appropriation of our cultures?
So we
Do you
came
want
up,
to
yeah,
read?
with some ways to do that. So I will read the first five. Number one, boycott. Number two, call out, holding those people accountable. Number three, buy directly from indigenous and Afro-Indigenous vendors and small businesses. Number four, do not haggle them, pay a fair price. Number five, support indigenous and Afro-Indigenous people and their work.
And then number 6 through 9, educate yourself. 7, listen to the community calling out the cultural appropriation and support them. Do not try to defend the appropriator or silence the community speaking out. 8, learn how to be uncomfortable when you are called out for cultural appropriation. 9, do not partake in it if it has been called out already, like wearing headdresses to Coachella. And something I want to talk about, or one thing I want to add to number 8 is like, I think most people have participated in some kind of cultural appropriation in some way or other, even myself included. And like that was because I was ignorant and I didn't know any better. But something I want to, there was a response that said that the leis are also culturally appropriated, and like I had a lei during my graduation ceremony because in my head I was like, oh, these are pretty flowers, like I want to wear one, without knowing that it actually came from Native Hawaiian cultures. But now that I know that, I'm like, oh, that's not part of my culture. So, and if I don't get it from like a Native Hawaiian vendor or don't consult with like Native Hawaiians, then I don't think I feel comfortable like wearing one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, I think it's just a part of growth. Like I think as long as we can recognize and learn and move on and grow and support these indigenous people and Afro-Indigenous communities, I think ultimately it's healing for everybody in the long run. So
Yeah, especially
yeah.
in the Polynesian culture, right? Because also the Pacific Islands have their own lace. Like I feel it's important to also mention that it is their indigenous women who are weaving these lace together. And for my graduation, I received a lei from a two-spirit relative from Guam. And I learned a lot about what the significance of wearing a lei means. And as you mentioned, it is important that we also learn from our mistakes, because as we get older, we start growing and we start learning new things. And I feel like it's okay to be uncomfortable. because our biggest growth comes when we're uncomfortable. And it's thank you for acknowledging that, we all partake in cultural appropriation and that you learned a lot from, Lays and what it signifies to the Pacific Islanders and Polynesian cultures.
Mhm.
Because it's hard to acknowledge that you also make mistakes and that, because life is a learning process. But as long as, we started centering those voices and now we have learned more about Lays and their significance because of it.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you to that person for bringing that up. I think that's important too. Um, yeah. Oh, and one more thing. It's so we launched a directory under daughtersofmother-earth.com, and there you can find Indigenous-owned and led businesses and services. And we're trying to get as many Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous people under that directory so we can give y'all shout-outs and promote your work and support your work. And I think that's one of the ways that people can be in solidarity with Indigenous people regarding cultural appropriation. So supporting Indigenous-owned businesses and artists directly instead of, reselling and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for listening to episode 3 of Daughters of Mother Earth. This was our episode on cultural appropriation part 1. We hope you have a nice day, and thank you, Stacy, for all the knowledge that you shared with us. And we hope you learned something. And it's always important to keep an open mind and an open heart because life is about learning. It's a learning process, and it's important to uplift and amplify the Indigenous voices, especially from our women, LGBT, queer, and two-spirited and non-binary folks. Do you have anything else to say, Stacy?
Yeah, I just want to thank our audience and our followers and all the people that support us. This is a project that we deeply care about, and I'm very, very, very grateful to Jessica for her energy and all of her labor that she puts into this project because, I just feel like there's a lot of learning and growth that happens here, and I'm very grateful for that. So thank you all for listening and supporting, and we look forward to hearing your responses.
Yeah, and if you want to continue supporting us, please become a patron sponsor. You can become a sponsor by simply donating $1 per month. And it was very unique to create that, launch that Patreon because we were able to relate every tier to a native flower from Oaxaca. So please become a patron sponsor or help us spread the word. Thank you again for listening to Daughters of Mother Earth. We hope you have a nice week and the rest of the month.